Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're jumping straight into a really fascinating and highly detailed framework, Ricardo Gomez's Project 2029. Basically, this is a comprehensive six-part constitutional blueprint that lays out a massive argument for completely rebuilding democratic governance. Whether you're deeply immersed in American political systems or you're watching them from afar, this series gives us a really structured look at exactly how our institutions, rules, and rights all interact with each other. Here's our roadmap for the explainer today. 1. The vision of broken eggs. 2. Fixing the democratic machinery. 3. Rewriting the economic rules. 4. Enforcing fundamental rights. 5. The view from downstream. And finally, 6. Accountability and building anew. Let's get right to it. Starting with Chapter 1, The Vision of Broken Eggs. Gomez actually anchors his entire foundational premise on a quote from Abraham Lincoln, written way back in 1864. Broken eggs cannot be mended. It's a great metaphor. His core thesis here is that returning to a pre-Trump normal is entirely impossible. Why? Well, because he argues that exact normal is what cooked up the current crisis in the first place. You literally can't just return to the conditions that caused a systemic shock and then act surprised when it happens all over again. So the big takeaway the author pushes here is reconstruction, not restoration. Project 2029 argues that if your instinct is just to restore the system, you're kind of refusing to look at what actually broke. If you're wondering how we prevent future crises, Gomez's answer is that the United States must actively reconstruct a brand new constitutional vision from the ground up, rather than trying to patch over an old, compromised foundation. Moving right along to Chapter 2, Fixing the Democratic Machinery. The author insists that any progressive policy is pretty much useless if we don't first overhaul the actual mechanical rules of power. To fix the machinery, the project calls for sweeping, structural changes. We're talking eliminating the Senate filibuster, expanding the Supreme Court, scrapping the Electoral College, setting up strict federal redistricting standards, and granting statehood to D.C. and Puerto Rico. Gomez argues these mechanical fixes are absolutely crucial to stop a minority of the population from illegally blocking legislation that the majority wants. Now, right alongside those traditional reforms, the blueprint includes a totally modern preemptive measure, a statutory ban on AI personhood. The project argues that political standing, literally defining who actually counts as a political subject in our democracy, has to be settled in hard statute before the courts can distort it. So artificial intelligence shouldn't be allowed to hold property, enter contracts, or claim constitutional protections, and any liability has to rest 100% on the human creators. Okay, on to Chapter 3, Rewriting the Economic Rules. Here, the project makes a super sharp pivot. It contrasts our current ownership economy, which Gomez says focuses way too heavily on wealth concentration, with a proposed worker power economy. To truly reconstruct democracy, the blueprint suggests we have to stop looking at antitrust laws as just some legal tool, and instead use them as a core governing philosophy to structurally guarantee strong union power and worker leverage. In this framework, extreme economic concentration and political authoritarianism are treated as the exact same threat. To actually make that massive shift happen, the blueprint leans heavily into mechanisms like sectoral bargaining. If you aren't familiar, this means negotiating wages and working conditions across an entire industry, rather than just going company by company. The author proposes that bringing these kinds of European-style labor frameworks to the U.S. is politically necessary. It creates a solid floor so non-union competitors can't just keep undercutting unionized employers. That brings us to Chapter 4, Enforcing Fundamental Rights. Gomez makes a really strong case here that fundamental protections have to be permanently locked into statute. The argument is that civil and human rights are way too vulnerable if they're just left up to executive interpretation. By putting things like a new Voting Rights Act, affirmations of birthright citizenship, fully funded asylum adjudications, a total ban on family detention, and even a statutory reparations commission into hard law, they can't just be erased by a future president's executive order. All right, Chapter 5, The View from Downstream. This is where the narrative really zooms out to the international stage. Gomez explicitly brings in the perspective of people all across the globe who live downstream of American political decisions. Think about it, whether it's trade agreements that export labor standards or climate policies that impact low-lying nations, choices made in Washington have massive global ripple effects. The author points out that these international observers often clearly see the flaws in the U.S. system that domestic observers completely miss. The view from downstream clarifies what the center obscures. Because of that global impact, the series argues that America has to completely ditch its current transactional foreign policy. To win back any real global credibility, Gomez says the U.S. needs a highly consistent, values-based approach. The argument goes that you just can't credibly advocate for democracy while simultaneously selling weapons to authoritarian governments. So, a reconstructed foreign policy would unconditionally tie military aid to human rights compliance, applied across the board with zero exceptions for allies. And finally, Chapter 6, Accountability and Building Anew. This section pulls everything together. The blueprint frames massive public investments not just as separate policy domains, but as intertwined absolute baseline conditions for citizenship. Project 2029 argues that if your ability to stay alive depends on your employer, or if your kid's education depends on your zip code, the architecture of your democracy is failing. Because of that, Medicare for all, universal pre-K, higher education reform, and wartime-scale economic decarbonization by 2050 are presented as mandatory structural pillars. Now, this is where it gets politically thorny. The project pushes for a serious public reckoning. A lot of political agendas skip over this part, but Gomez argues that historical amnesia basically guarantees authoritarian behavior will repeat itself. So he calls for establishing a statutory truth commission with full subpoena power, actually prosecuting officials who weaponized federal power, and forcing binding Supreme Court ethics and campaign finance reforms. Pretending the damage didn't happen only normalizes impunity. Look, the project totally acknowledges that an agenda this massive is going to face incredibly fierce, well-funded resistance, but it doubles down on the idea that the cost of failing to reconstruct the system is catastrophically higher. As the author points out, suppressed voting rights produce unrepresentative legislatures, which then just suppress voting rights even further. You have to break the cycle, no matter how immense the political cost is right now. The long-term price of inaction just far outweighs the immediate friction of reform. So, as we wrap up this explainer and look at the sheer scale of this blueprint, we are left with a massive question. Based on all these arguments, what will it truly take to build what was promised? Are we going to keep trying to mend broken eggs by restoring the past, or will we do the hard work of total reconstruction? I hope this overview gave you a clear structural understanding of Project 2029. Thank you so much for diving into this with me today.